session. We've gone from virtual events and hybrid events and talking about live case studies. Now we're going to talk about measurement and success. So I'm going to introduce you to your speaker for this session, Laura Davidson from Tag Digital. Just a bit of housekeeping for those who are here live. For anybody who has a headset, once you've finished, if you could drop it in the black box on your way out so we can make sure they're sanitized. And also, if you would like to ask any questions, please do go onto glister.live/ETL21 or scan the QR code. And then Laura will put the questions to the panel in the last 10 minutes of the session. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thanks everyone for joining. Hope it's been a great show for you. And thanks so much to all of our panellists who are joining our session today. So today we're going to be discussing the need to know benchmarks for 2022. In events, everyone always wants to know what's good, what should I be looking to do, what should I measure, what are my competitors doing, and that's really what we want to cover today with our expert panel. So what should you measure, what's good, and what can you do for 2022? So we're just going to kick off with an intro to all of our panellists. So we've got Clive, Imogen and Luke. So if you guys want to just go in order and just take a minute to say who you are and what you're most excited about for benchmarking and data in 2022.
Me first. Yeah. So hi everyone, I'm Clive Morris, Director of Research at Explory. For those guys who don't know Explory, we are a research provider exclusively in the event space. Everyone who's been here at EventTech Live will get a survey that's come through our platform, and a lot of what we do is post-show research, but also we do a lot of bespoke research outside of that as well. And to answer Laura's question about what's exciting in the data world right now, a number of those projects are seen as bringing data from many different sources. So in a world of APIs, we can now see data being brought in from many, many different places. And I think that is what's exciting right now. The days of seeing data in silos, so your survey data, your registration data, your financial data, I think they are increasingly dead, and now it is putting everything together to see data in a holistic way.
Amazing, thanks. Imogen?
Hi everyone, my name's Imogen and I'm the Head of Digital at EasyFairs UK. So I look after all of our tech and software, and from a tactical point of view, support everyone with websites, SEO, PPC, email, and also social. We're an organizer of events, conferences, awards, and also produce the occasional magazine. So there's quite a few products that we promote. And to answer Laura's question about what I'm most looking forward to about benchmarking and data in 2022, it will probably be, now that we're launching live events again and potentially going to do some hybrid events and combining that with online events, is figuring out what the new normal is post-lockdown and hopefully COVID.
Amazing. Luke?
Hi, and I'm Luke Bilton. I'm Chief Growth Officer at Expo Platform, and so we do 365 communities and smart events. Before that, for the last sort of 20 years or so, I've been working as sort of VP Digital at organisers like Informa, UBM, places like that before joining EventTech. The thing very similar actually to Clive's point, the thing I'm most excited about is bringing together all of these different data points and insights from various different sources. I think that what COVID has sort of revealed, I think, is how fundamentally broken most event technology stacks were. And at the time, that seemed to be okay, like it was okay that nothing talked to anything else. But now it's clearly not okay anymore. And the types of insights you can get by connecting the dots is really interesting and very valuable.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so let's get started with our questions. So, Clive, maybe you can kick us off with why is benchmarking so important for events?
Yeah, so why is benchmarking so important? Ultimately, without benchmarking, you are just collecting data, and without benchmarking, you will not have any context to that data. So, we'll often work with clients who say, yeah, we collect a net promoter score, say, in the survey world. Well, that's great, but how do you know if that net promoter score is any good? How does it compare to others within your organization, within your portfolio? And then thinking a bit more externally, actually, how does it compare to the outside world? So, how does your data, be that survey or anything else, compare to other organisers globally in your sector? Ultimately, with that contextual piece, all you've got is data, and you haven't got the understanding and you haven't got the context there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that you guys are doing a lot, is bringing together those kind of standards and helping people say, well, what's good, and kind of all the eccentricities within that data, which I think is hugely important.
Absolutely, because you might get a net promoter score, say, of plus 30, but actually, if in your industry or in your sector the benchmark is plus 50, well, is plus 30 any good? And that's just one of many examples where, without that context, and as you say, Laura, that's the key thing we do at Explore, is to provide that context, provide those benchmarks. All you've got is a set of data.
Yeah, amazing. Great. And Imogen, maybe you could kind of help us understand, how do you start even setting targets when you're looking at all this data and start to put in place, well, what's good, and especially looking to 2022, which is going to be a really hard year to forecast for everyone?
Well, with our target setting, we use our benchmarks massively as the ultimate pool of data to help set the context around what's happened in the past, primarily, and help us frame what is going to happen in the future through our target setting. And we do rely a lot on our historical data as that initial baseline of information. And then what's more important now than ever for us with our target setting is reevaluating the context of where we are in the present day, which we've taken for granted in the past and are definitely not doing now. But we have completely pivoted our target setting approach recently for a number of reasons. I mean, we are moving to a new way of marketing where we market throughout the year and talk to our audiences throughout the year in many different forms. And with every element of marketing, we need to benchmark the data and then potentially find a target off the back of that. And throughout doing all that marketing activity throughout the year, it just extends the timeline for data collection and target setting. So we were used to doing it 3, 4, 6 months ahead of an event, and we're just doing it all the time now. So that's created quite a few more challenges in terms of reading the data, compressing it, analysing it, and then working that into target setting.
Yeah, and something else that you'd said before that I think is really interesting is looking at setting targets as ranges maybe, and using that rather than, I think we have all learned we know nothing sometimes with the target settings in the last couple of years. It's been really, really hard. So thinking about, well, a range is more beneficial and more realistic probably.
Definitely. I mean, we're trying to be as realistic as possible with when we set expectations with our targets internally and externally. And we've definitely moved more to a period of setting, as you said, a range. We'll have a base range where we hope that everything is viable, and then also like a blue skies target to excel and try and hit on top of that without creating confusion or too much of a challenge.
Yeah, these terrifying numbers at the beginning.
Definitely.
Fingers crossed. Amazing, great. And look, I know you guys are dealing with lots of different data sources. How do you kind of bring that together, and what metrics and kind of key data points are you using to set your benchmarks?
Sure. So I think the most interesting type of data, I think for me, is behavioural data. So behavioural data is so much more, I think, meaningful and impactful than registration data ever was, because you're seeing the actual user's behaviour and what they're doing. And since we went from pre-pandemic to during and post-pandemic, the amount of data which you collect from behavioural data can be like 20 times more than you were collecting previously. So that's a massive data set, really rich data there to mine and do something with. And there's a massive opportunity for that. So I think behavioural data for me is like, if you can really get under the skin of that, and how you sort of can break that down into micro communities, different clusters of engagement, because an event, particularly an exhibition, isn't just sort of one thing. It's usually made up of 20 or so different micro communities and different connections. That's the fascinating bit for me. That's sort of, I guess, on platform during event behavioural data. I'm also very interested in sort of off-platform intent kind of data, but maybe you can talk more about that than I can, Laura.
Yeah, for sure. And just as you're talking about that, I'm thinking, what we're seeing is there's so much data that we can't process it anymore. So we're leaning really heavily on the machine learning side of things. So Google, Facebook, everyone, they're collecting 5,000 data points on all of us, and we just don't have the time. So yeah, and I think that's been really interesting for us because it's driving predictive advertising and it's giving us data that we just wouldn't have access to. And the other things, I think, on the intent side of things, I think there's two parts to that. You know, we're getting the intent from the users, so you're getting served ads just as you're thinking, and everyone's thinking, oh, my phone's listening to me, but it's not. We're just being measured every single micro action that we take, who we're hanging about with, what Wi-Fi networks we connect to. So you're served the thing before you even know that you need it. So I think that's one side of it, is the predictive advertising, but then also leaning on things like Bombora and getting that kind of intent data coming in. So we're able to use kind of third-party data providers and say, you know, how do we build data from these other sources when we're going to have things like cookies are retired, or it's just harder to reach data that we might have had access to before. So I think intent and predictive kind of advertising is huge, and that's how we're going to reach new audiences and build new data when we're going to be restricted on iOS platforms or cookie retirement, all of that. So yeah, I think those are the areas we are quite excited about. Great. And what would you say are your key benchmarks? Like if you say, right, we're going to target 3 things, and these are our 3 kind of need to know, what would you be your kind of 3 things that you'd go for? Clive, maybe you can start, kick us off.
I think rather than give a single answer to that question, what I'd say is for any company is think of what the right benchmarks are for you. So tie the benchmarks to your objectives. Just because another company is setting a benchmark around X, it doesn't mean it's the right thing for you. So you should really be thinking about what are the objectives of your events, what's the objective of essentially what your organization is there to do, and then tie the benchmarks in around it. So yes, there's probably will be some things where there's commonality, and clearly what we do at Explorer is to have some commonality around things like satisfaction with an event or net promoter score. But beneath that, just think about actually what is relevant to you as an organizer and put the benchmarks around that. And the second thing I'd probably say is think about going a level below the headline scores. So again, to go back to net promoter score, actually start to set targets and benchmarks around the things that are driving that net promoter score. So at the end of the day, all these things, particularly from surveys, are just numbers. This is your satisfaction score, this is your net promoter score. Understand what's driving those numbers, and they should really then be the things you're starting to target and start to benchmark against.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think maybe we come at it from a slightly different angle in that we do have very common things that event organisers want to do all the time. So we did 2 different benchmarking reports, benchmarking 100,000 campaigns on like we do have quite similar things. Exhibitor lead, how much should that cost in this sector, in this region, if you're doing a security event in Dubai or a marketing event in London or something. And then our visitor cost per acquisition. And we found that, it's never going to be perfect. There's always loads of context in the numbers. It's not, it's a launch event, or, they've got a huge competitor in the region or whatever it is. But we found kind of setting those like 2 big things has created a benchmark that's been really, really helpful for people. So yeah, we probably have less objectives, but yeah, I think that's good, and we've got links that we'll share with those. But yeah, we found that helpful. Great. And we were talking a bit before about benchmarking, or kind of what does success look like pre and post pandemic. So is there anything that you're kind of factoring into your thinking with that, and where you're seeing the kind of big changes with the numbers and the measurement of the data? Maybe Imogen, you can start with that one.
I think it's a really interesting question. Obviously, we're all trying to analyse where we are post-COVID. And I think from our point of view, with our exhibitions and conferences, we have our business macro objectives, which haven't changed, whether it's live or online. So that has seen us through the whole way. We're still trying to drive partners, pre-registration, and attendees. And then, the micro goals do alter slightly. So for our online events, we might be driving like percentage of sessions viewed or connection requests that have been accepted or declined. And then for our live events, it might be smart badge touches or registration sources or something like that. And I think success in terms of difference in timeline, we're actually seeing positive results even from live events that have started to take place in the past month. So yeah, we're feeling positive about it.
Yeah.
definitely.
And I think that's been something we've seen across all of our organisers is everyone's kind of anticipated this COVID bump and factored that into the target setting, but we've been quite pleasantly surprised by everything, but you just don't know, what to trust. But yeah, we've kind of seen the same, that actually everything's been over what everyone anticipated, which has been nice. We seem to be in a bit of a really kind of upswing at the moment. Great. Clive, anything you want to add to
Yeah,
that?
I can speak to that as well, and it's very much what you two are saying, where particularly for those events that have gone back in person since lockdown restrictions have ended, for a number of those events, they're seeing some of the best customer satisfaction scores that they've ever seen. And I think there's a few elements to that. I think it is, people were just so desperate to get back to an in-person event, and there's a bit of, their acceptance that the event might be a bit small or there may be more restrictions, but actually there was this real desire to get back to that in-person experience. And secondly, I think a lot of organisers have very quickly got onto actually what do we now need to do to run an event successfully in a post-COVID world. So I think, yes, we are seeing exactly the same thing where a number of our shows are seeing really strong scores, which is obviously great to see given the climate that we're in. But yes, it's not just one or two, it is an increasing pattern of shows performing really well at the moment.
Yeah, I know. Happy days. So, look, how do you go about when you're thinking about the data that you've got and maybe ideally what you'd like to get to? How do you kind of analyse the gaps and what you guys are going to build out next, or what insights people want to see? What's the kind of process around that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that we recently asked a whole bunch of organisers. So we're in the process right now of like revamping our analytics dashboarding, and we wanted to understand what are the questions that event organisers really need to answer. So it's not just displaying the stats that we have, but trying to say, well, what's actually going to sort of move the needle for organisers. So as part of that research, I think we had over 40% of organisers were saying what they actually want to understand is return on investment, return on time. How do you actually measure the value of what's been happening on the show floor? So what's the value of the connections? And then after that, there were other metrics they were interested in. So how do you measure the whole customer journey flow from online to offline back to online? And NPS was also there, but I think that was around 17% versus this like ROI, which was 40% plus we're interested in. So that's really interesting. And so there's different ways that you can start to sort of piece that together. Often it's a bit of a proxy for the actual end deal that's happened, but things like connections and meetings that have happened, scans as well, are all sort of like indications of that. Then there's RFPs and tendering, which is actually I think another really interesting area. So rather than sort of letting visitors just like wander around and hopefully make those connections, it's like how can you curate that a bit more? And if you can build in that sort of tendering process into it and create those connections a bit more meaningfully, then you can get your visitors to say, well, I've got a budget of £20,000 to procurement budget to spend at this event. And in your post-show reports, you've actually got, we had £1.5 million worth of budget was decided within this period. That to me is where it becomes really, really interesting. If you can get down to that sort of financial data. And I think we're getting closer to it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also now everyone does have a much more kind of 365 approach. And I think, everyone says, oh yeah, we got X amount of visitors and we had this amount of meetings. Oh, what happened after the meetings? I don't know. Did they do any business? Don't really know. But actually, if you track that over the course of a year and you said, well, actually, that was the return on investment for that exhibitor, which is what we all do as exhibitors, is when we're exhibiting, how many leads did we get? What revenue did it drive? So if we could start to build that data in, and have that kind of year-round approach, then you're like, that was the ROI and that's our average ROI. And I think, yeah, it's really powerful to do that.
Yeah.
Great. And then Imogen, what do you think are the kind of common mistakes maybe that you make when doing benchmarking, or what do you feel is always measured and isn't that helpful? Anything like that you can talk to?
I think in general, and there's a massive over-reliance on historic data, and especially like with the recent changes that we've seen, it's so great to have all of the data as a baseline, but it is a historic view, and it isn't going to manipulate the future just by reading, too much into the data. And it's really to take the benchmarks and the data and then decide an appropriate plan of action off it, and a realistic one. And I think that in terms of things that people might be doing wrong or have an over-dependency on, might be the reliance on give me one moment. I've completely distracted
I
myself.
just add something to what you were saying there. So I think something that, we do search all day, every day, 50% of our campaign budgets. And what we found recently with doing dynamic search ads is 15% of the queries are brand new every single day on Google. So there's new technology, and we can do a mind sweep on that. But that's kind of like, we do the stuff that we know is going to work, but actually there's just this like 15% grey area that we have absolutely no idea of if it's, we don't even know people are searching for it. So I think it's just that kind of always being open to the way we search is changing every year. The data is new every year, and it's changing all the time. So I think it's what we did last year isn't necessarily going to work this year because it's changing.
And I think what I was going to say before as well was that there's so much data that's being compiled, and often it provides an internal view of what's going on. But in that process, just provides you sometimes an internal view of what is good and bad, and sometimes getting away from that and analysing each individual brand or exhibition or conference itself and siloing it instead of creating that just for the sake of it.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it, 'cause there's so much context that goes around different sectors, different regions, different reasons for things. So yeah, I agree. Great. And then Clive, anything that's what's been your big surprises in the data coming out of the pandemic? Anything that you're like, wasn't expecting that?
No, I mean, I think the big thing has been what we've talked about, which is when events started to go back in any great volume, July, August-wise, we just didn't know how they were going to perform. We just couldn't set any expectations there. We knew events would be smaller, and we knew there'd be restrictions around them, but actually how would that play out with attendees and exhibitors? And as I said, actually the surprising thing has been that for many of the major organisers we work with, they're seeing that a number of their real key flagship shows are getting some of the best scores that they've ever got. So I think for me that would be the biggest surprise. Yeah. It's a very pleasant surprise, obviously, but I think that's our key thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with us. I think the other thing we've seen is just the decision making has got even later. So we always know we get that 2 week and everyone's like having their 6 week freak out, and then we kind of get 2 weeks. But now it's like 4 days, 3 days, and everyone's just having complete panic attacks. But it's always okay in the end. But it is the decision making is very, very late. We found
Absolutely.
that, which has been a little tense. Great. And look, something else we were chatting about, and obviously is a huge topic at the moment, especially in Glasgow. But sustainability is huge, for events, for event organisers, for everyone just now. So is there anything around, benchmarking, and how do we kind of make sure that that's something we're all actually doing and remain accountable to the stuff we're saying we're going to do?
Sure. So there are, I'll try and remember what the carbon calculator is I'm thinking of, but there have been some actually quite interesting carbon calculators in the event space recently. We've actually been interviewing quite a few people about that over the last few weeks. But I won't name the organizer I'm thinking of, but they recently published their sustainability report, and I downloaded it and I was like reading through it, and I thought it was really interesting that their sustainability report for last year didn't mention at all the fact that they had a carbon neutral year, and it was in terms of sustainability, it was a ridiculously sustainable year because they weren't running large-scale trade shows. It wasn't mentioned at all in their sustainability report. They talked about everything else. They talked about diversity. There was buried on like page 4. There was like a mention of virtual events, and maybe we don't know what's going to happen in terms of that because we haven't calculated it properly. And there's obviously reasons why you wouldn't announce that to the city. But some of the studies I've been looking at suggest that virtual events are 99% more sustainable than an average-sized European trade show. 1% of the carbon emissions. That's what isn't being put into organisers' sustainability reports for obvious reasons. And so the answer isn't to stop doing events. Then the whole business model collapses. But it should be part of it. And another study, and this is perhaps a bit more achievable, was saying that for a large-scale international trade show, if the 10% of people who travelled the furthest, if they attended hybrid rather than going to the show, there's a 90% reduction in carbon footprint. Wow. So it really is down to that air travel from internationals who've travelled the furthest. So, virtual isn't the only answer, hybrid isn't the only answer, but it's got to be part of it, I think, and particularly if you target those internationals who are going to really make the biggest impact. And then there's lots of other things to solve, but if you could tidy up 90% of your carbon impact, I don't know why you wouldn't do that. And so, to me, I know virtual has not entirely come of age yet, perhaps, but with everything that's happening with Meta and the way things are going, it seems unrealistic to me to think that virtual shouldn't be part of it, and you should have hybrid meetups and ways to connect people in between your large scale events. So that to me feels like a bit of a no-brainer.
I think that sounds extremely sensible, and we've kind of witnessed it when we looked at. We've done 5,000 meetings across the team over the last few months across 18 countries, and the emissions that we saved, and we would have flown all over the place, Dubai, New York, all the time to do these things, and we've still grown the business and we've still done all the stuff, but we did it virtually. So I think when you start to see those numbers, it is powerful, and like you say, I think the format of virtual, having that kind of amazing in-person experience, but also on demand, there's so much weight now given to that, which I don't think we all took that seriously going back a couple of years ago. Like, we knew it was there, but it just wasn't a realistic thing that we were going to do, whereas now I think we are all joining later and getting content and having meetings later, so I think it's given kind of gravitas to that whole process that maybe wasn't there before. Great. Okay, and how am I doing? So, we'll just, anything else just to add, Imogen or Luke, in terms of surprising things in the data, stuff you're like, like that, don't like that, didn't know that was going to happen, just that you want to add, and then we'll go to the audience questions.
I think from EasyFair's side, when we were launching our first online events over the past year, what we were really surprised and pleased to see with the online events that we will continue to do alongside our live events was that they were really great as a data opt-in strategy. I think we saw on average about 50% of the data for our online event was brand new, which is really great. And then also on top of that, it was a really great engagement strategy. I think we saw 30% of the data that registered for online we had, but hadn't attended a live show for 2 years prior to COVID.
Wow, that's
so
interesting.
We were really happy about those two things.
That's amazing. And do you think that's like a logistics thing, or just, I don't know, time thing, or?
I think hopefully it's led by the content of the online events that were put on, and maybe going with the quality of that and not quantity throughout the year. Because there was definitely, in the last quarter, maybe a bit of fatigue off the back of that, and I think that's why it's so exciting that we're going back into live events or hybrid and a combination of all of them.
Yeah, amazing. Great. And look, anything to add?
Yeah, well, one of my biggest surprises last year, I've been working on a show called CPHI for many years, so it's like a big pharmaceutical event which sort of runs around Europe mainly, but obviously there's geo-adapts as well. But it's kind of a bit of a juggernaut, and we've been doing it year after year, and the rebook was just going up and up and up. And something like the big sort of like aha moment for me was when we took that virtual last year. And something that I certainly never looked at was, well, if I now I can see the actual behaviour of what these people have been doing. Like previously, you just funnel people into like massive trade shows and just like let them find their own way around. But then being able to filter by procurement, for example, as a job title, or R&D scientists, and actually see what they were doing was absolutely fascinating for me, because I'd certainly never thought about it in that way before. And the type of content that someone in procurement was looking at was very, very clearly defined, all about buying trends, buying and selling in different countries. The type of content that scientists were looking at was much more about chemical formulation and how you do that. And looking at that side by side, they were completely different shows. And I hadn't really appreciated that within a large event like that, you have these completely different shows. And I think it gives a lot of credence to some of the data that we're seeing, that smaller, more focused events actually have far higher engagement levels. And I think that's why personalization is such a massive opportunity now. It's like you can still have the large shows, but you really need to give everyone a very focused agenda, the type of people, products, meetings which are relevant to them. And then you can have that very hyper-focused micro experience within a larger scale event. But yeah, the more focused, the more personalized you can make it. It just works so much better for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and we've worked on CPHI, and the platform stuff they're doing is amazing, and I agree. I think it's the quality of the data that they're getting out of it, and I think that's what we're getting from the virtual and the hybrid. Is we just didn't get that kind of quality of the data before in terms of like content consumption. So yeah, no, really interesting. Amazing. Okay, so we've got lots of questions to get through from our audience. So, okay, what we'll start with. So I'll just go from the top. So how do we benchmark marketing campaigns, and how do we know what's a good target for the current climate? Maybe that's one for me to answer. So yeah, I guess probably from our point of view on the paid digital side, we look at all the different campaigns we do in a year. So we take 100,000 campaigns each year, and we look at things generally that people are optimizing for. So conversions, cost per acquisition, how much does it cost us to get a lead, a visitor registration, an exhibitor inquiry, and then we look at that across different regions and different sectors, because I think there's a lot of context in all of that. And we've kind of come up with adjustments. So it changes from brand to brand, but we're probably seeing between a 15 to 30% uplift maybe in things like cost per acquisition, and we're seeing decreases in the overall targets. But then, to speak to everyone else's point, we're surpassing all of those targets. So I think it's pretty fresh, the numbers that are still coming out just now. So far we've made adjustments, but we're kind of getting close to what some of them were anyway. So yeah, I'd say we look at the big key objectives, benchmark all the campaigns, pull it all together, anonymise it, and then put that into a kind of calculator. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Maybe Imogen on the marketing side, or anything else you want to... I mean, you've kind of spoken to some of that.
I think that it's really difficult to use an existing data set to predict the future in the current climate, which is what the question completely hinges around. And I think for us, we're really trying to take our existing data and then model it out in a target, but based on some realistic percentage changes. And that's just across the board, across all data sets, and just being really realistic about it.
Yeah. And do you think there's any metrics that can predict how well an event will do in the future? Do you think there's anything kind of early stage you're like, that's a winner?
I mean, I think we found that we've only just started doing live events and haven't really got a data set that we can year on year predict for online events yet. But what we're finding is an indicator of success based on a past data set is less the monetization and the broad level concepts and stats. It's looking at the finer detail of the engagement stats of the community and seeing how engaged they are as a whole. If they were a year before COVID or throughout during the online events, there's a high indicator that they will continue to be as long as the correct content is being provided. Yeah.
That's interesting. Clive, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to that. So we've actually just recently completed a big data analysis piece at Explory where we looked at the 4,000 trade shows that we've measured to see actually do any of our survey metrics predict growth. And what was absolutely clear from that is those shows that perform above the benchmarks, so those that overperform on satisfaction, on NPS, on loyalty, they do see increases in attendee numbers and exhibitor numbers in the following year, but that's on average. I think the question here is about, can you specifically predict it for one individual event? And that's where it's a little bit less clear cut. And it's interesting to hear what Imogen said there in terms of the data that she's been looking at, because where we now are with the project is what can we then mix with the survey data to get a combination of stats that you can use to predict future growth for your event. So that is the next step in that process, really.
I'm sure everyone would be really excited to get their hands on that. Anything you want to add to that, Luke? Or?
I think, well, just on that point about return on investment, return on time. So what are the factors that makes it feel like everyone's had a worthwhile experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Great. And of course, we want to look at the individual objectives for a company or for an event, but do you think there's one thing that you could say is the most important marketing benchmark to set? I don't know. I guess it comes, from our point of view, cost per acquisition drives everything, so if it's going to cost us £100 per registration, our budget, our attendance, everything's going to look really different if it's £5 cost per acquisition. So yeah, I think that's probably the number one thing. If and our clients say we want awareness and we need to be on CNN and having to post, and they're like, yeah, great, but if we don't deliver on registration or they don't deliver on registration, the whole thing's not gonna fall apart. Okay, I've got 5 minutes left, so I'll get through these. So everyone says they want to go back to in-person events, but in-person registrations are still lower than virtual. What do you think we should expect in 2022?
So, it's hard to call, but I've been to a couple of in-person events over the last couple of so Confex, Event Technology Live. As an exhibitor and visitor, the numbers I think are probably, in terms of like quantity, are probably lower, significantly lower than you'd have in previous years. But I think for both of those events, I think we'd have said that the quality was probably okay, or pretty decent. And that to me feels like that's a very common message across the industry at the moment. So even if there are fewer tire kickers, that the quality is up. So the challenge then is how do you communicate that? How do you prove that to both sides of the equation? As well as, if people are more comfortable and used to doing things virtually now, used to connecting with people, used to not having to travel to Dubai and to New York for face-to-face meetings, how do you do both? So to me, the right combination is having a 365 approach, being able to facilitate those connections, bundling that up in what the exhibitor package is. So you're not just buying a couple of days of time, you're actually buying a 12-month period of engagement in order to do all of that activity. But then also for the actual physical event experience, having much better, stronger metrics about the type of quality which is going in there. So it's a mixture of quality in person as well as year round to give you the volume of leads.
Yeah. And also I think that goes back to your point that you're talking about in terms of ROI and what can I get back from it. So if quality's up, then ROI should be up in theory, and you're maybe not wasting time on people who you're not going to do business eventually, you're not going to do partnerships with. So that's maybe how that eventually gets communicated out, is it's going to be a more efficient use of time, and there's still all the nice awareness and meeting up with pals type thing as well. Great, okay, these two maybe grouped together a little bit on kind of sentiment and behavioural data. Clive, is there anything you want to say about that? How does that fit in? And maybe, look, you can add to that too.
I think the key thing is that it does fit together. It is holistic. It isn't just, here is the behavioural data, here is the customer feedback data, here's the financials. It all has to come together. You have to be viewing this in one place. You have to understand the interrelationships between them. And when it comes to sentiment data, it isn't just getting your metrics. Yes, they're important. There will always be satisfaction, NPS. We've made a business of it, so I'm going to say that. But it's also delving into the comments that your attendees and exhibitors are leaving as well. So why are they feeling what they're feeling about the event, and understanding those. And again, with the AI technology we have, you can very quickly now process thousands of comments very quickly to understand actually what is driving the scores that you're getting. So you have to look at the quantitative, the raw numbers, but you also have to look at some of the qualitative aspects as well. Why are people thinking what they are thinking? And as a result, what can you as the event organizer do to address that? And probably one final quick thing is I would look at that on both a micro and a macro basis. So what we'd always say when it comes to survey data is, if you've got an exhibitor who's spending a lot of money to set up at your event and they're expressing something on an individual level which they're disgruntled with and is potentially calling into question their likelihood to exhibit next time, then you need to act on that just in the same way that you would act on looking at the global macro data, which is understanding the overall performance. So when it comes to sentiment data, yes, you have to look at the big picture, but you also have to look at the micro level and use that as a tool to essentially get any customers who are at risk of churn back around for future years.
Yeah, I think that's really true in kind of questioning some assumptions that you've maybe made about that data, and I think that's something that we've dealt with recently, that we always go after performance and CPA and that's like the main thing, and we just assume it's the main thing, but actually when we get feedback from our clients, they're like, I wanted more feedback on the creative or something else, and we're so focused on the numbers. I think getting that context around why they're giving that feedback is super helpful. Great. Anything else to add to that? I think we're maybe out of time. Yeah. Okay.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to Luke, Imogen, Clive and Laura. Thank you.